welcome to another scholarship highlight, brought to you by the Center for Firearms Law at Duke University School of Law. This series is a part of the Center's broader effort to deepen the scholarly discussion around firearms law by engaging directly with one of the many scholars doing important and innovative work in the area. I'm Jake Charles, Executive Director of the Center, and this week we're joined by Jane Stoever, Clinical Professor of Law at UC Irvine School of Law, as well as Director of both the law school's Domestic Violence Clinic and the UCI Initiative to End Family Violence. We're going to be talking with Jane about her article, Firearms and Domestic Violence Fatalities, Preventable Deaths, recently published in the Family Law Quarterly. Thanks for being here, Jane.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. So first off, just what is the article about in a nutshell?
Yeah, so it's really about preventing domestic violence, firearm fatalities. And I framed the article by examining the highly gendered nature of domestic violence, of intimate partner violence, and firearm ownership and intimate partner fatalities, and then really grapple with a lot of the challenging realities of implementing gun safety measures in the United States and propose legislative reforms and public health, and then really just pragmatic community solutions.
Yeah, and so I suspect that your work is one reason that brought you into this article, but can you talk a little bit about why you wrote it and what kind of was the impetus for it?
Yeah, great. So several years ago, I hosted a conference called The Politicization of Safety through that center that you mentioned, the UCI Initiative to End Family Violence, and ended up publishing a collected volume out of that convening. And I used the phrase politicization of safety to have multiple meanings in terms of thinking about movement politics, also thinking about what's become unnecessarily politicized. And so we're thinking about the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act and certainly firearm safety measures. So one of my chapters in the book concerns the politicization of firearm safety measures when we think about this is an area where we have so much data and we have all of these science-backed recommendations and actually broad constituent support across party lines. But we see this being treated as a real partisan issue. And so that originally brought me to this topic. And also, of course, I co-chair our county's domestic violence death review team. You don't even need our team to exist to know that almost all of the fatalities that we are reviewing and examining are firearm fatalities. So this is an area of deep concern. And then with this recent article, I was invited to write this article for the Family Law Quarterly. And this is the Journal of the American Bar Association's Family Law section. So I was especially excited to be able to reach this broad audience of judges, attorneys, and other scholars.
Yeah. And so who do you see the article being in conversation with? So you mentioned some of the particular audience members. What other kind of ongoing conversations, either scholarly or practitioner, are you joining when you jump into this debate?
So many in terms of the scholarship in the area that your center has been so great at highlighting. And then also, as I mentioned, attorneys, judges, mediators, therapists, all of these people who are in these roles where they could be playing real violence prevention roles, but fail to broach the subject of gun safety and really miss these opportunities for intervention. And so thinking about the laws that we have on the books, but also the massive implementation gaps in enforcement and the opportunity to talk to these folks in the legal realm about public health perspectives. And it's so much a topic for all of us in our nation because we're seeing just in the past several years, domestic violence homicides having increased by 33%. And scholars attribute this to a divided nation and more of a normalizing of misogyny. And we see research that racial prejudice interacts with aggressive attitudes to produce higher levels of ownership. So as we right now, we're talking via Zoom and in the midst literally of pandemics within pandemics and these global movements against racism, dehumanization, injustice, and calls to reimagine public safety, then this is an opportunity also when we're thinking about these topics and having new conversations that I feel like we really haven't been able to have before in our nation.
Yeah. So let me dive into some of the specifics then of the article. So one of the things that you've talked about a little bit so far and a little bit in the article is the combination of intimate partner violence and firearms. And I'm just wondering, can you give us a little bit of that picture here. What does it look like when we combine firearms in a situation where there's intimate partner violence?
It's really dangerous. I mean, the short story is that it's incredibly dangerous. So we know statistically that intimate partners with guns present the greatest fatal risk to women, and the risk of domestic violence homicide increases 500% when the abusive partner has access to a gun. So rather than a gun in the home, increasing the household safety is so often the reason given for firearm ownership. We know a domestically abusive individual is likely to use the firearm to perpetrate abuse. In a study here in California, it was found that in nearly 3/4 of battered women's households that also contained a gun, the abusive partner had used the gun against the abuse victim by either threatening to shoot at her or by actually shooting at her. I've also really motivated to do this work because of my work representing abuse survivors over the past 2 decades, and just seeing that far too many of my clients have had their lives threatened with guns. And I'll mention just one. It was a woman who described how her boyfriend opened the shower curtain on her, cornering her with a gun as she bathed. And she, of course, thought her life was over, and worked so much with her and with my law students in our law clinic, and was overwhelmed by this. We did all of the important legal work and safety planning for her, but then alone in my office later that day, I just closed the door and sobbed. I was so relieved that this woman was alive, and so much feeling that nobody should experience that terror that she experienced. And we know right now, as we're going through still a global pandemic, the United Nations predicts that 6 months of the stay-at-home mandates to prevent the spread of COVID-19 leads to 31 million additional cases of domestic violence globally. So this is, of course, really important messaging in terms of if we've been faithfully staying at home. I'm talking to you from my home right now, but have to think about the assumptions within that stay-at-home message, assuming that home is a place of safety when in fact being under an abusive partner's control and threat of violence is extremely dangerous. And I'm talking a lot about this because I'm really passionate, but if I can mention just one other area of teen dating violence implications, because I think that we have not yet really thought about this enough. And we had the really powerful March for Our Lives movement that needs to continue at the same pace. But we now also have research showing that new studies that teen dating violence is highly associated with firearm possession. And we normally just think of the fact that youth under age 18 are generally prohibited from possessing handguns, but male youth routinely have access to firearms. A recent pre-pandemic studies showed that approximately 1 in 16 high school students in the United States report having carried a firearm in the past 30 days, and that 22% of youth reporting firearm possession owned highly lethal, rapid-fire, large-clip automatic or semi-automatic weapons. So I feel like this is just an area that we're not focusing on yet enough as a nation.
Yeah. And so kind of building off of that, one thing that always strikes me when I read about specifically mass shooters is this history of domestic violence in their backgrounds. And it's something you talk about in the paper. And I'm wondering if you can share maybe why you think that is. What is the connection here between these public displays of mass violence and this history of domestic violence in their past?
Yeah. And so, of course, there are a lot of people who utilize violence in relationships that don't then become mass shooters. And so I always want to be really careful in terms of causation and correlation. But we also know that there's so often, and in a majority of cases, when we look back at the histories, that there is that history of domestic violence. And so in terms of some of those dynamics, thinking about masculinity that emphasizes dominance and control, and that valorizes violence as a way to prove self-worth, and that positions women and LGBTQ individuals as inferior, are some of the dynamics that we see. And we saw that with Omar Mateen and the Pulse nightclub massacre. Entitlement and lack of empathy. There's a lot of discussion around that with the 2014 Santa Barbara mass shooting by Elliot Rodger. And then I also, within our cases that we have Orange County is the sixth most populous county in the United States. And so looking at all of the cases of the domestic violence fatalities that we see as we're literally reviewing cases in the coroner's office, and then looking at those histories, see a lot of people who feel like they've lost everything. And so you look back and you see job loss and somebody feeling like they've lost everything they've worked for, or family, kind of different points of family crisis. And so whether it's a dissolution of a marriage, somebody losing custody, losing any visitation rights, and those cases that we represent in our clinic where the opposing party is denied any custody, any visitation at all, any contact, sometimes cause me to pause because that can also feel scary in terms of if is this somebody who then might feel like they've lost everything, that there's nothing to live for. And we see intimate partner homicides often extending to broader tragedy with the murder of bystanders or children. This happened here in our community in Orange County with the Seal Beach Salon massacre. So there are a lot of deep tragedies that our nation continues to mourn.
Yeah.
But this early intervention that you mentioned is so important. And so we know that, I think I have a statistic in the paper about how in California, just in 2018, so recently, of the nearly 170,000 domestic violence related calls to law enforcement, over 45% of those calls reported the use of a weapon in the incident. So we can and should be paying attention to this a lot sooner. And the rates in terms of firearm surrender, seizure, removal don't match up with those reports that we're seeing.
So let me ask, so moving a little bit to the solutions, if we're recognizing there's a problem when there's a combination of maybe one individually, domestic violence, bad no matter how it occurs, but when it's combined with firearms can maybe have even more lethal effects. And one thing in the paper about the, quote, gendered knowledge gap about firearm ownership. Can you talk about what that is, first of all, and then how that affects what the legal frameworks are for best addressing intimate partner violence?
Absolutely. And so we know that men are 4 to 5 times more likely to purchase and store firearms than women, and that guns then end up being viewed by all family members as the private property of a particular family member, which is most commonly then the man. And in homes with firearms, 80% of men and women report that storing the guns is solely the man's responsibility. So we see the gendered nature of the possession and then the storage responsibility. And then I was honestly surprised when I started researching this area to see the highly gendered knowledge gap about household gun ownership. For men, there are now many studies of heterosexual couples in households where men report owning guns when the woman does not think that there are any guns in the home, or the man reports owning more guns than the woman is aware of. And so when we think about our legal responses, then so often they're predicated on what does the petitioner or complainant report? And so within our domestic violence petitions here in California, there's a question about does the opposing party own or possess a firearm? And so if my client isn't aware that a firearm is in the household, then that doesn't then prompt any of that firearm surrender. And I also, we've been having really, seeing all the social movements around this, and Brady and Moms Demand, Gifford, March for Our Lives, and so much training now, even through the local PTAs about thinking about talking with families about firearms and safe storage practices when setting up play dates, for example. And so, we think we're doing the right thing as parents in terms of talking to other parents about, do you have a pool at your house? Does your child have any allergies? Any pets? And do you have any firearms in your house? So we're asking all of these questions. And I realized I was often maybe talking to the wrong parent. And so in terms of how we think about our both our community solutions and what we do in our own lives, and then also what triggers the legal responses, this is an everyone issue. And so we have to think about our advocacy really reaching across gendered lines as well.
Yeah. And so continuing with some potential solutions, one thing that I often hear, and I'm wondering, how much you hear this and what you say when you do, is that one of the ways to combat intimate partner violence is by, at least against women, is by arming women, so that they have a tool to fight back when they're being abused. Do you hear that? And kind of what do you say in response to that kind of argument?
Yeah. And of course, the gun industry had attempted to really increase female ownership of firearms by targeting women's fears. And so we saw the 1990s campaign, Refuse to be a Victim, equating gun ownership with empowerment and characterizing female gun possession as the quote unquote last frontier of feminism. And in terms of how this has played out more recently, we see several years ago, Governor Chris Christie vetoing gun safety measures regarding domestic abusers, instead proposing to expedite abuse victims' access to firearms. And then a recent Indiana bill was proposing to allow domestic violence protection order recipients to obtain a firearm without a license, background check, or training, and to give a free gun to everyone who obtained a protective order at taxpayer expense. Unsurprisingly, the statewide domestic violence advocacy organization opposed this. And so you are absolutely right that this is still a prevalent talking point and even something that's being suggested by our legislators. And what any of us who do work on anti-violence and who represent survivors know is that this just increases survivors and children's danger. And so that's the simple answer is that no, it's this is not actually saving lives, but it's actually increasing danger for the survivor and children and broader society.
And so in the last section of the paper, you talk a little bit about some legislative solutions to help combat the problem. Could you talk about what those solutions are, the proposals that you have in the last section there, and how they might help reduce violence?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an area where part of what's so heartbreaking about all of the tragedies that we mourn is that we have the answers in so many cases. And so the fact that universal background checks are supported by 97% of the American public and are proven to reduce domestic violence fatalities by 47%. This is huge. We now have so much research that the gun safety measures actually work and that they effectively reduce these homicides. And the more measures that the state level legislation has in place, the lower levels of intimate partner homicide. So things like universal background checks, having a national registry, extending timeframes to actually conduct the background checks so that we can avoid the Charleston loophole, as it's kind of more colloquially called now, as we saw through the initial Brady Act imposing a 3-day limit for the National Instant Criminal Background Check System. But that limit serves now as a loophole, allowing approximately 6,700 firearms to be transferred to individuals with prohibiting domestic violence records during less than a decade. And so to be able to actually implement the laws that we have in place is really important in terms of then strengthening the laws. Think about licensure in terms of regulating firearms as much as we do automobiles and drivers, and closing loopholes in VAWA, which many states have taken the lead in doing, but it works so well that we should be doing this on a nationwide basis. So just to mention a couple of being able to prohibit gun possession and purchase when there's a domestic violence temporary restraining order issued, as we do here in California. So funding research to match the scope of what is really a uniquely American epidemic, and looking to all these research-based solutions, including what your center proposes. And then having broad knowledge of the laws. And so addressing that implementation gap so that we actually have enforcement of gun surrender and removal laws. Only 18 of our states currently have laws that address the seizure of firearms at domestic violence scenes. And as much as we do on the legal front, which we know that there's a lot that we can do in terms of putting in place some smart legislation, also grappling with the reality that the United States has 4% of the globe's population, but 46% of the global stock of civilian firearms. And so thinking about some really practical measures in terms of attorneys needing to ask about domestic violence. I see far too many family law attorneys say, well, I don't do domestic violence law. I don't do domestic violence work. But It's not that it occurs everywhere. I certainly don't think that. But by not asking the questions, you miss the opportunity to safety plan and to actually address these issues. Having judges ask and not simply rely on a petitioner's knowledge of whether or not there are firearms based on the gender knowledge gap that we mentioned. And then really taking a public health approach. Our nation has done this in other areas. I won't sit in a car without my seatbelt on, even if the car's parked. It's just an instinctive thing. You put on your seatbelt. And thinking about what we did, I think back in the 1980s, 90s with the Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk campaign, which was so successful. Over 2/3 of American adults now report that they have stopped a friend from driving drunk. And so our courts, they might not always have the information to be able to have an actual restriction in place. Events may not have risen to that level. But messaging, our courts can message to folks that, if this is a time when marriage is dissolving, you're going through high conflict custody battles, you're facing domestic violence charges, that this is an especially important time for someone else to hold your guns. And I think that hasn't really been part of our national discourse yet. But in terms of how we care for each other and how we look out for each other, that's a really important thing that people can do.
Yeah. So let me ask one final question here that takes a little bit beyond the domestic violence context. And it's, there's these new laws that are sweeping the country, extreme risk protection order laws, and they date back to 1999 in some form, but really a lot of them have come about in the last couple of years now. And they were sort of modeled off of the domestic violence restraining order template. And I know that for domestic violence situations, the DVROs sometimes provides more and better protection than an IRPO would. But I'm wondering if you have thoughts on either implementation or enforcement of IRPOs drawn from your lessons working with domestic violence restraining orders.
Yeah, and it is exciting to think about all the different varieties of legal remedies that we might have and what best fits the situation. On, I think it was February 28th of this year, which now feels like worlds ago, we hosted a conference at University of California, Irvine School of Law through the Initiative to End Family Violence that was specifically on these gun violence restraining orders. And we're addressing some of those intersections. And so part of it in terms of then the implementation is just knowledge of it. And we've done some great work in our community here in terms of making sure that law enforcement has knowledge of this remedy, that the courts are familiar with it, and the public is really familiar with this, because we're looking at individuals and family members being able to seek this remedy when they know of a loved one who poses a danger to themselves or to others. And so it may or may not fit the mold of the domestic violence restraining order or civil protection order, but when someone seems to be a danger to themselves, threats of suicide, other risk factors. And so it's good that we have different remedies for different situations. And then also thinking about, I'm glad that you mentioned the extensive protections through the domestic violence restraining orders, because we do have this new remedy that people are looking to and that we're holding a lot of programming on. But it's still important when there is the domestic violence dynamics to be able to see the really broad ranging injunctive relief available through our restraining orders or protective orders. And so making sure then that folks in the IRPO, or call them the GVROs, all the different acronyms, that with those extreme risk protection orders are also familiar with the domestic violence restraining orders and vice versa. And so making sure we're not operating too much in silos, but that somebody is able to then get the full range of relief that they need, and seeing how well are we enforcing these. And so the fact that we now have then the extreme risk protection orders that focus on the risk of gun violence, I think can also then be helpful for enforcement in the domestic violence restraining order realm, which globally we haven't done, and nationwide we haven't done a great job as a nation in terms of enforcing the provisions that do exist. So I think all of these are really important remedies to have available. We can think more about safe implementation. I always want to do safety planning with clients before going into court then. And this can all be done in quick emergency fashion, but making sure that there's also safety planning done around the issuance and that when somebody seeks a gun violence restraining order, for that to be really important. And I'll mention that when we held this conference at the end of February, still in the largest lecture hall in the law school, and hoping for a future year when we do that again, our opening speaker was a woman from the south side of Chicago who spoke based on her lived experience of having lost 30 loved ones to gun violence. And she talked about how she has seen all of these laws go into effect in our nation over the past few decades now, and strong message that you can have all of these laws, but until you address the underlying problems, until you really help communities, that you won't really see that change. And so I'll just also offer that message that we have to do the really hard work of examining and addressing what's behind the gun fatalities and this epidemic that we have here in the United States, as we also think about different legal solutions to these issues.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. It was very informative, and it was great talking to you. I appreciate all your insight and for taking the time today.
Thanks so much.